I really wanted to write something that kind of simplified things for parents, that allows parents to really trust that if they just can connect with the basics of what we know helps children be resilient, develop healthy lifestyles and routines, sort of step out of the chaos that we're all living in right now. I want to provide some resource that would allow parents to navigate all that easier.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm Debbie Reber, your host, and today I'm talking with Dr. Mark Bertin, a developmental pediatrician who specializes in the promotion of child development and developmental disorders such as ADHD, autism, and learning disabilities. Mark is also the author of The Family ADHD Solution, Mindful Parenting for ADHD, and his most recent book, which is the focus of today's conversation, How Children Thrive, The Practical Science of Raising Independent, Resilient, and Happy Kids. There were so many different directions we could have gone in for this conversation, but we did our best to stick to the topics of how to develop resilience, both in our kids and ourselves, the ways in which executive functioning impacts all aspects of a child's development, and how mindfulness can be a powerful tool to help parents manage the uncertainty in day-to-day life. And now, on with the show. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Debbie.
Okay, well, as a way to get started today, can you introduce yourself? Just give us a little bit of background about your work. You have a lot of experience that's very relevant to my audience of parents with differently wired kids. So tell us a little bit about what you do and the books that you've written.
I'd be happy to start with that. So I'm a developmental pediatrician, which is a subspecialty of general pediatrics that works just with kids with difficulties and differences in school, behaviorally. A lot of the children I see have ADHD or autism, learning disabilities. So clinically, professionally, that's what I spend all my time doing. But I also, many years ago, was introduced to the practice of mindfulness, and that's a whole other story. So initially, that was kind of in parallel, and I kept it to myself and just had my own practice going. And then as the science around mindfulness expanded, I realized it was kind of silly to be keeping it separately. So in my writing in particular and my work for anyone who wants it, I also integrate mindfulness. So I've written 2 books that integrate mindfulness into care of ADHD and 1 book that integrates it into general parenting.
Yeah, it seems like kind of a unique voice in this conversation, to be marrying those 2 pieces. They're both things that we've talked about on the show, but I've never had someone who comes, through both of these different lenses and integrates. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I feel like it's totally natural. It's really, for anyone who's familiar with mindfulness, there's a lot of stereotypes and cliches, and it can feel almost intimidating. Like, how can I, be so perfect and calm all the time? Except that mindfulness is really the opposite of, or the intention is really the opposite of that. The intention is recognizing that things in life can be pretty challenging and uncertain, and we're never going to be perfect. So the practice of mindfulness is really about managing real life. And a lot of the premise of mindfulness to me is really exactly what most parents would benefit from or need. So the core assumption is that things are going to be uncertain and challenging, which is really true for all parents. And, on some level, a lot of our day-to-day resilience relies on our just helping build the traits that help us manage, that real life situation.
Yeah. I think that's why your work resonated so much with me. That's a lot of what I personally believe and what I share with my community so often is, especially when you're raising kids who are moving through the world differently, so much of it is about our own experience in that and how we choose to feel about it. So I really, as I was reading your book, I was like, yes. So much of the language just really spoke to me.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm glad that's true. And I think first of all, on some level, the practice of mindfulness is as much about just seeing our lives clearly so we can, live as well as we can. It's not about being quiet and still all the time. And, that may seem abstract. I feel like even as I started this interview, I've been a little abstract in describing mindfulness because it's all meant to be just very real. It's just meant to be recognizing that when life gets challenging, we tend to sort of be on our heels and in reactive mode and really feeling stressed. And as a parent, it's so easy to get caught up in fear and, get really wrapped up in all the hard decisions we need to make. And a lot of what I'm, teaching, advocating for with mindfulness are skills that just help you manage that so that you can make your choices easier. You can, feel more confident in your own parenting and maybe let go of a lot of the stuff, the extra stuff that's causing more stress than you need in life.
So you're bringing up so many things that I want to talk about. But before we get into that, I'd love to even just have you take a few minutes to tell us about your new book. It's called How Children Thrive, The Practical Science of Raising Independent, Resilient, and Happy Kids. So just tell us a little bit about why you wrote that and what you're hoping it offers readers.
Well, the reason, I think there's two things to look at. The why I wrote it is because I think in our sort of information-saturated, pressured, perfectionistic online world, I think a lot of what's going on the internet is just really pushes parents in ways that aren't realistic. I really wanted to write something that kind of simplified things for parents, that allows parents to really trust that if they just can connect with the basics of what we know helps children be resilient, develop healthy lifestyles and routines, sort of step out of the chaos that we're all living in right now. I want to provide some resource that would allow parents to navigate all that easier. And I think so many parent books pressure parents to be one particular way or do things one exact way when, life is kind of simpler than that sometimes. Like you do your best knowing what you think is going to work best and you have to trust that that's going to work out. And so I wanted to provide something that just cut through a lot of the extra, made things really more straightforward. So what has kind of in a very fortuitous way kind of come together for me as a developmental pediatrician is there's all this new research developing around how children can become resilient and more specifically a developmental path called executive function, which may sound wonky, but really is just how children manage their day-to-day life. And it turns out different than I was even taught in medical school, that this aspect of development starts in early childhood. It really matures into your mid to late 20s and really explains a lot of what you can expect for your kids at different ages, how you can set kids up for success in school. And, again, I don't want to imply that it's the only answer, but it does tie together a lot of real core foundational concepts that parents can know about how you can set kids up around like getting sleep and homework done on the one end. And then because executive function ties so into managing behavior, managing social situations, managing school, if you can really understand it, again, the word I always feel like, don't get caught up in the language of it, just understand the concept. If you can really understand how children manage their lives at different ages, it really allows you to focus on this kind of core skills that children are going to develop so that they can navigate things on their own one day. And that ties back to mindfulness again. So it's in my field, it's this one developmental path that sort of really can help you stay grounded in a sort of basic core focus on, sometimes I call it the modern science of back to the basics parenting. Here's what we can focus on that really matters and maybe, let go of the rest.
Oh, it's interesting to hear you describe your vision for the book in that way, because, in reading it too, it did feel like you just presented things in such a accessible way and really did cut out a lot of the noise, if you will, or, it was just, here are some things to think about. Here's kind of what you need to know. And you offer lots of simple ways to view so many of the concepts that you're sharing. So in this subtitle is the word resilience, and that's something, I get a lot of requests from parents who want to talk more about that on the show. We know that that's really important for our kids. We also know that a lot of differently wired kids, that's a lagging skill or something that they may struggle with because of other things happening in their lives. Can you define resilience for us and tell us why it's so important?
Well, resilience, I think the simplest way to look at it is, resilience is the capacity to bounce back from and persist through difficult times. And as a parent, as hard as it is to, I mean, it's one of the things that's often stressful for us is recognizing we can't and shouldn't manage everything for our children. We need to set them up to do things on their own over time. And, there's a great quote, I don't remember where it's attributed to originally, along the lines of you can't cover the road ahead for your children with leather, but you can use that leather to make a nice pair of hiking boots. So, we can provide children with, over time, the ability to take care of themselves as they get older. And I mean, there's so many nuances to that. I think sometimes there's a disconnect of just recognizing that at any given age, that does mean something slightly different. It doesn't have to be sink or swim, because a lot of the skills that go into resilience are pretty immature, like in early school age, so that students require, that it's okay to get a little involved then as a teaching point. It's almost like instructing kids in how to manage a hard situation. And it can be conversational, and you let them take the lead, and it's not being an over-involved parent, as long as you're always aware of providing opportunities for independence and sort of giving them more and more opportunity for that over time. And this does tie back to that same message of when you really look at what goes into resilience, it's that same sense of just foundational things. So one of the biggest ones, for example, is consistent relationships. And that may seem trivial, except that as life gets busy and challenging, I mean, two things happen. One is it's easy to just lose touch of that time. And, when you look at like research in teens, for example, just having consistent family meals is considered protective from a lot of stuff you're trying to avoid with your teenager. So teens who have consistent family meals tend to, have less risk for behavioral and emotional issues, for example. And then on the other hand, I think it's important that when I'm sure this has always been true, but I can only comment on the culture we're living in now. In this sort of media, internet-driven culture, there's always this pressure that we have to be doing more and more to help our children, when we can just reassure ourselves that if we have like a solid family life, that's a big thing. We've already accomplished a lot there. So one foundation is relationship. Another foundation has to do with an idea I'm gathering you probably talked about some, called mindset, which is a belief that our own effort matters. And again, that's a simple thing to focus on, and we can do that. And then when you cross over into populations where kids are having difficulties, the other two foundations do become something that's a little more challenging and we have to focus on. A third is similar to mindset, but I think slightly different, is just having a sense of our own strengths and what we're good at, and trusting in that part of our lives too. That's particularly important for kids who are having difficulty, say, in school or difficulty in their social lives. We want to help them find that true success. I think sometimes there's, kids see through, I think, when we're, trying to reward them for things that aren't real. So it's really trying to find their true successes and things that they connect with. And then the last piece of resilience, which I think is not emphasized enough and does have a lot to do with ADHD, with autism, with learning disabilities, is executive function itself, because we haven't really defined executive function yet today. So executive function is a cognitive skill set that just has to do with life management. It's like the CEO. It's the part of the brain responsible for coordinating and organizing and planning everything. And you're not supposed to have a lot of those abilities, in early childhood. You have some, and then it's supposed to keep maturing so that by the time you're an adult, you can manage really complicated situations well. But executive function includes attention and behavior, but also organization and time management and managing our emotions and persistence and planning. So that one of the things I sometimes think gets overlooked is that if we want someone to be resilient, to, encounter something difficult and recognize what's going on and set up a plan and manage that plan and stick that plan through to the end, those are all executive function-based skills. So there's a skill set that is required to be resilient in essence. And that, I think, is a nuanced part of childhood that's often underestimated, particularly when kids have ADHD specifically, because ADHD is a developmental delay, practically speaking, in executive function. So in our school system nowadays, actually in the United States at least, there's a big emphasis on self-advocacy and problem solving yourself and problem-based learning, and all of that's wonderful for the kids it works for. But if you have poor executive function, if you're behind in executive function, you're behind in those specific skills, and we have to meet you where you are developmentally and kind of lead you forward to more of those skills, as opposed to just expecting you to suddenly, develop them out of thin air.
Yeah, we've done several episodes on executive functioning. We've done, I think, 3 just with Seth Perler, who's been kind of our executive functioning guru on the show, unofficial title, but he has played that role. But I'd never heard, I also read that in your book about ADHD being a developmental delay of executive functioning. I'd never heard it that way before, but it totally made sense as the mother of a child with ADHD. So I'm just wondering, and there's a lot of other things I want to touch base on about your book, but any best practices or resources on executive functioning for those of us, most of us listening, have kids who have lagging executive functioning skills? Any kind of favorite resources or places that parents can start?
Well, truthfully, there's a lot, and I have a whole ADHD page on my website of just related resources. And that, I'm never comfortable with sales, honestly, but that is the whole premise of the ADHD workbook I have, is how do you work with ADHD as a delay in executive function. But Thomas Brown has great books on that. There's several other books on it as well. I don't want to just promote myself in any way. But the core premise, which I think is more important, is if you're a parent living with a child with ADHD, it's really important to me that executive function feels like, it doesn't feel like some sort of academic abstract concept. It really is the nitty gritty of how you help someone with ADHD catch up. And it really, as a parent, will make your life easier to understand the nuances of it for many reasons. Like, for example, when you look at the cliche, the sort of the stereotype of ADHD, it's about a short attention span. When you look at it through the lens of executive function, you recognize that it's about managing attention, which means it can have moments of hyperfocus where you can't get yourself out of something that's really easy and enjoyable. When the demands go up, you can't focus, and that can get mislabeled poor effort. And then really on a day-to-day level, the fact that you can't transition attention is, a heart of living with anyone with ADHD, but it can come across as defiance or I'm being ignored, when quite often it's just that it's somebody with ADHD who's really engaged in playing or reading or watching TV. They really can't hear you if you try talking to them at the same time, because they can't shift their attention. And that's the level you want to begin to understand executive function on as a parent, because that's where a lot of the solutions come from.
But there are solutions.
They're definitely, kids with ADHD will do great if you understand it fully. It's just that, I'm happy to go whatever direction you want in terms of topics today. But, I think in order to manage ADHD thoroughly, you really need to acknowledge just how wide-ranging and challenging a condition it is, so that as a parent, you have a child who's behind in the skills that allow them to be independent, so they're going to require more of your support than longer than their peers. It's emotionally difficult when kids are struggling as a parent. It's, there's so many levels to look at it. So I think one of the things that's under-acknowledged about ADHD, it is the premise of why I started why I initially was integrating mindfulness into ADHD care, had more to do with parents needing support and parents being swamped than their children specifically.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50.
And then from a child side, ADHD is a chronic and long-term disorder that initially may come across as a school or a behavioral difficulty, but over time affects anything potentially that requires management in life. So I was just reading an article before we started talking today, another study looking at ADHD, for example, in driving accidents. It's been shown to affect health. It's been, shown to affect stress and anxiety. So all of that is important to acknowledge, because if you can see it that way, it certainly, I think in the short run, often becomes more overwhelming. But in the long run, if you see it for what it is, which is mindfulness, if you see it with clarity, you can manage it. You can take care of all. It takes a lot of work, but you can do it. Kids with ADHD do great when they get full supports.
Well, as you're saying all of this, it's just striking me that I think, this is the case for me personally, and I imagine for so many people listening, is that we have kids who are moving through the world differently. We get to know and understand who they are based on how they've been identified as, what's going on with them. And then I think over time, so many of us, we focus on certain behaviors or things that we're addressing, but we forget that all behavior is somehow related to what's going on with them. So I don't know, something that you just shared just really struck me, that I think we can be very solution oriented and we forget to always step back and look at the big picture, that all of these different pieces, the emotional regulation, all of it, things that might just seem annoying or little behavior things that we think we've already addressed, that it's still really just a part of how they're wired.
Right. I think clearly in the big picture, especially in the midst of challenges, we're all going, sometimes it can take work to just focus on what's going well and the bigger family picture, that overall big picture of just, happy, resilient families. And yet I do think when it comes specifically to kids who have struggles in different parts of life, sometimes we do need to sort of pause. And when it comes to ADHD in particular, I sometimes call it like looking through the lens of executive function, because sometimes you have some chronic difficulty that just seems entrenched or like a quirk, or just, like you're just struggling, going around in circles over it. And if you pause and sort of look at it and say what part of this could be, related to their ADHD, or that same thing could go, even for any other, learning disability or high functioning autism, you sometimes can step back and say oh, wait a minute, maybe that has to do with social pragmatics or when it comes to autism, or maybe that has to do with executive function when it comes to, some real subtle nuances, like executive functioning involves emotion, so that kids who are struggling as they get older with something as subtle as like frustration tolerance, just giving up too easy, it can be important to recognize that, oh, wait a minute, that's something to work on, but it's not necessarily their fault. That's executive function again, or the inability to realize, like in a high school student who otherwise is doing well, they just may not recognize like the need to or how to study. And it's like you feel like it's easy to get caught up in fighting over it and struggling over it. And come on now, if you just study. And then sometimes you have to step back and say like, okay, wait a minute. What if potentially, hypothetically, what if what this came down to was somebody who just can't see life that way yet? They don't see time that way yet. They don't see long-term planning that way yet. What if it was a skill we have to work on and not someone sort of willfully not studying?
It's such a helpful reframe. So I want to actually shift to the parents, because we've been talking about how to support our kids, but really so much of your work, and again, why it really resonated with me, is that you are supporting parents in living more intentionally and just having a different experience in their day-to-day life and how that can support the whole family. So I wanted to actually just talk about this idea of emotional resilience in parents. You talk about that in your book. Can you share with us how we can develop emotional resilience ourselves?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a great one, and it's easy to lose touch with it. You get, obviously as a parent, your priorities shift a lot, and quite often your kids' needs do have to come first. But there is that reality that, if we're going to be at our best for our children, we need to take care of ourselves, at least some. We have to find that core of time we're going to prioritize and activities we're going to prioritize that let us stay at our best more often. And there's a few different things to think about. One is, in the big picture, it's not that I think everybody has to practice mindfulness. That's obviously not true. I happen to find it useful, and a lot of and obviously a lot of the people I've worked with do. But more importantly, it's each of us individually finding what helps keeps us healthy and strong, and really, not letting go. One of the best pieces of advice I often come back to was something someone told me going into medical school, which, is nothing, I don't want to, everyone has their medical school, whatever it is that they go into that's, really, really challenging. And the advice I got was find one thing that helps keep you, one activity that helps keep you sane, and don't let go of it no matter how crazy and busy things get. And I think the same basic sort of foundational, like no matter how busy things get, I'm going to find time for this, is important as a parent too. And then in the, when it comes to being a resilient parent, there's a few different things that are important to know. One is, even in adults, relationships are part of what keeps us resilient, and both within our marriages, if we're married, with our friends, with our kids, just remembering that as busy as life gets, as pressured as life gets, that's something that's really valuable and we don't want to let go of, is really important. And in some, for some people, that actually may be a pretty significant step to take at first. There's a second piece of resilience in adults that's just like with kids, which is recognizing our own strengths and effort. Because, in a perfectionistic world, when we look at mindfulness, we often talk about this very self-critical voice. In psychology, I shouldn't even say mindfulness. In the field of psychology, there's also, when it comes to resilience, we often have this very habitual, demeaning inner voice that, most of us relate to in some way. It's that voice that as soon as you screw up kind of says, you blew it again, you can't manage this. And, that begins to affect our resilience over time. So we can, we need to value our own effort and really work on that too. And then, the third thing, which for anyone who chooses to do it, are, really working on the skill set. Really executive function is a concept that goes all through life, all the skills that help us manage life more easily. And that's, for me, what comes back to mindfulness again, because really the broader premise of practicing mindfulness is we're working with being more, getting out of autopilot, getting out of reactivity for longer stretches of time, because when we're just caught up in the autopilot and stress of day-to-day life, we tend not to be seeing things clearly. We tend to be making the same decisions we've always made and saying things the same way and managing things the same way. So that being clear-sighted, giving ourselves the opportunity to make changes starts with enough self-care that we can basically be settled and take that new step. Because a lot of the time, I think the answers to challenges it's less that we need more information. It's less that things are so complicated, although clearly sometimes, there are complicated situations. But quite often, we just need to catch ourselves long enough and then, either trust our own instincts around it. I think, one of the things that in modern life is quite often tied to that is like managing screen time in kids is a good example of something where the cart gets ahead of the horse and things get really crazy. And sometimes if you just pause long enough, you can recognize that, your gut sense that maybe you need to rein things in is probably true. So a lot of the times, if we can pause long enough, we do know what we want to be doing. We just kind of lost touch with it. And then, another piece of it is that we can learn to manage our own emotions and stress more skillfully, because not that we've ever done anything wrong, but because we can develop that as a trait almost. Because really, in any situation, and particularly within families, quite often the only thing we can directly manage is what we're adding or not adding to a particular situation. So we can just on a day-to-day level make that a practice without expecting, perfection, but just make it a practice so that over time, we're able to navigate all the, the intensity that comes up in families more skillfully.
We'll be right back after this. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything, because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Are you overwhelmed by the things that get in the way of you doing what you want to do? Are you looking for ways to simplify life to better align with your values? Do you want to create space in your schedule so you have room for more of the good stuff? Play, joy, relationships, gratitude, and more? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I invite you to check out Edit Your Life, a podcast to help you edit the unnecessary from your life so you have more room to enjoy the awesome. Through episodes with me, Christine Coe, and a range of super smart, compassionate, and thoughtful guests, you'll come away with big picture insights and practical ways to declutter your home, schedule, and mental space without getting bogged down by perfection. I have always believed that small moments and actions matter tremendously. My goal is to help you find agency and space in your life through doable baby steps that will leave you feeling accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Check out Edit Your Life wherever you enjoy your podcasts.
Quick break. Yeah, I love that you talk about getting off autopilot, and I think that is so important, and just being intentional, and also just knowing that it doesn't look perfect. It's more about the intention, right? And making that choice every day, just how we want to show up for ourselves, for our family, and then knowing that some days we're going to get it right and some days we're not, and then we start over the next day.
Yeah, the whole we can talk about perfectionism in parenting probably for, a whole hour, because it's such there's so much pressure to be perfect, to raise kids a particular way, to, meet these, crazy intense goals nowadays, when I think in schools in particular, to get into colleges, and then a pressure as parents, you think you never can make a mistake. But of course, quite often our own inner take on things is way different than we would advise our closest friends or our kids. Perfect is impossible. And there's often a sort of a misassumption that perfectionism is what keeps us motivated. It's way more nuanced than that, because when you look at it from a psychological point of view, and Kristin Neff has done a lot of really great research around this idea, if we're always aiming for perfectionism, really, it may feel like that's motivating us, but in the end, we're always going to fall short. And it actually, in the long run, undermines our motivation, undermines our ability to problem solve and think flexibly, because it doesn't leave us any room for just doing as good as we can and then figuring out how to correct ourselves when it doesn't go as well as we wanted, which is, much more what real life is like, much more like we would tell our own children to be living probably. And if you can let go of perfectionism, there's a concept Kristin Neff talks about called self-compassion, which is, can sound a little, I don't know what to people, it's kind of a little new agey almost, but it really is very straightforward. It just means that we're often way harsher on ourselves than we would be to anybody else when it comes to, just the perspective we're taking to our own efforts. And when you can shift that so that you are motivated, working towards goals, working to improve, self-compassion doesn't mean it's all good. We all have flaws, but it really just means that we can bring to parenting a much more realistic sense of, like you said, being intentional of just, I'm going to settle myself as best as I'm able. I'm going to look at this situation and try to figure out what I need to do. And then I'm going to sort of allow it to happen as best as it's going to without, that sense of needing things to be exactly one way or that sense of perfectionism.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of perfectionism, I definitely relate it to that need for control, trying to control who our kid is, trying to control the outcome of any given situation. And there was something that you wrote in your book that I really loved. You wrote, whatever your image of mindfulness is, it's nothing more or less than a direct way to handle the uncertainty of life. And I just read that. I'm like, wow, I had never heard mindfulness described in that way before. And it seemed so freeing, actually, to read that sentence.
Oh, I'm glad you saw it that way. And that often is, I think the quickest way not to practice mindfulness is to approach it, with that view that it's going to fix things or I'm going to be calm all the time. And that's the heart of it, is that things can be pretty uncertain and challenging, and all we can really expect of ourselves is to navigate that as well as we can.
So I have one more question that's a little bit new topic, but it's something I wanted to cover before, maybe for personal reasons, but I hope that it resonates with my audience too. You write about the negativity bias and attention, and so many of our differently wired kids have very kind of negative outlooks. They can be very glass half empty kind of guys and gals. They can really focus on the negative. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can help our kids shift away from their negative thinking, whether that's using mindfulness or other strategies.
Right. So the negativity bias refers to the fact that, probably for evolutionary reasons, things that are unpleasant or off or dangerous often grab our attention, and then they're just really hard to stop thinking about them and let go of them. So, and that's on its basic level what that bias means and what most of us are probably familiar with on some level. And so we don't want to get rid of it completely because, that's part of what keeps us safe in everyday life. But when it comes to kids, I think there's 2 or 3 things to focus on when it comes to helping shift that perspective in life. One is, first of all, just to set something aside because I think it'd be useful. In many ways, what mindfulness is talking about is just intentionally trying to build a bunch of traits in life that help us manage life easier. So it's not about stillness. It's about a lot of different things. So it's about working with the negativity bias if we choose, or working with the inner critic. And I just want to start by saying that only because for anybody listening, a lot of these things I'm talking about, you can work on however you want. Mindfulness does it very directly, but these are things that don't necessarily have to do with mindfulness specifically. When it comes to anything related to perspective, to mindfulness, to traits like that, some of it often just starts with our own take on life and how we're living ourselves, which is why mindfulness practice in particular, or, in any family, starts with parents. So part of shifting that in kids is just touching base with our own relationship to it and how we're working on ourselves, because just in day-to-day life, we can begin to shift the negativity bias if we can, in a very, realistic, unforced way, help label and note and show gratitude for and appreciation for all the things that are going well, even on a challenging day. So certainly some of shifting the negativity bias can just be looking at as a parent or as a family, how much are we focusing on that? And there's specific activities you can do, like a gratitude practice, that which just means at dinner or once a week, just showing appreciation for something that's really to be appreciated for. And I think it's so important to me that, for any of these things I talk about, they need to be very reality based. It's not doing it in a forced way and being thankful for things you're not really thankful for. But most of us have stuff we can really note. So some of it has to do with just family environment. And then a second one I think that's really important to recognize is that children are very much wired to learn from experience, so that one of the most profound things that can shift their perspective when it comes to the negativity bias or similar mental traits is really making sure we have the supports in place so that they actually do succeed. And I think that can be a little frustrating sometimes, but you almost have to, get the right supports in place and then watch and wait a little bit. But for example, if you have someone who has ADHD and is having a hard time in school, and then you get a really, treat their ADHD in essence, get a really intensive school plan in place and maybe some new homework supports and whatever else you do to manage ADHD through that shift so that over a year or two they are more successful, you'll usually see their attitude change. So that's the second part of helping them see their experience well. I already mentioned a third, which is if someone's having difficulty in one particular place in life, we often need to really expose them to lots of other activities until they find some other activity that they really thrive and get positive feedback from. And then, as part of that overall picture, we can come back to mindfulness practice specifically, because with mindfulness, over time, what you're doing is you're beginning to, the deeper practice has more to do with how we're living and how we're relating to, both our how we think and also how we live. So that one of the things you're working with as you start practicing mindfulness is recognizing as you're starting to settle, as you're starting to see things, that we have a lot of thoughts all the time, and a lot of them are valuable, but a lot of them are just random, and a lot of them are habitual. And part of the practice is beginning to create a little space from that. So you can begin to really, in other words, talk about, oh yeah, that's that habit. That's that there it is again. I'm caught up in that again. And then with mindfulness practice, what you're practicing is just coming back. It's just recognizing like, oh, there I went again. And now I'm going to let go of it. I'm going to create some space from it because I know that's my habit. And now I'm going to focus on, really, real life right in front of me again for a little bit. And what you can do with that piece of things is really begin to be much more discerning of which thoughts we have that actually require our attention, because certainly, that's real too, and which are just habit. I mean, a lot of anxiety, for example, is just I don't want to minimize anxiety, but I mean, a lot of us feel anxious a lot of the time. But a lot of what happens with anxiety is that it has more to do with attention and sort of related to the negativity bias than it does to do with overreacting. I think most of us can recognize this as a parent. So like something happens that triggers our parenting worry, and even long after we've already managed the situation, or even if there's absolutely nothing we can do about it, we can't stop thinking about it. So it's not that we're overreacting. The problem may be real, but it's an attention issue. It's like our attention is caught up in it. And that's part of mindfulness practice, is just practicing, oh, right, I'm caught up there again, and now I'm going to focus back here, and I'm just, making dinner now. So that's the last piece of working with the negativity bias, is to say, when over time, mindfulness is like a gym program, like over time you sort of establish it and start working with it. And over time you can start saying, okay, that's my habit, but I'm going to recognize it as something habitual that I can change.
It's so helpful. Wow. I feel like we covered a lot today, and there's so many little nuggets that listeners are going to take from this, as I have. So before we say goodbye, is there anything that we didn't cover or any kind of last thoughts?
I think there's just one thing I want to touch on briefly, is that one other thing that comes out of this sort of more developmental understanding of executive function, of self-management skills, is it often cuts through a lot of the stuff that just makes day-to-day living easier. So it's very practical on that level of just understanding in terms of sleep habits or homework habits or things like that. Cutting through expectations is often, maybe my 5-year-old does need me to be more directly involved, or really just cutting through and then recognizing that's only going to change gradually over time is often a way to de-stress situations, so that I just want to, that I want to make it clear that this isn't all about mindfulness. This isn't all about ADHD. It's like any parent can just begin to understand, where their children are developmentally really allows for a lot of freedom. And I think, this is something all parents can take advantage of and hopefully allow themselves to feel more resilient and happier, and their kids too.
Yeah, I think for so many people whose kids aren't really struggling with executive functioning deficits, they may likely have never heard of executive functioning. I mean, for me, I feel like it's something I've spent a lot of time reading and learning about and focusing on, but it is something that everybody has. It's a part of everyone's life, and everyone has, correct me where I'm wrong, but their executive functioning is in their own unique developmental space. There's kind of traditional, but everyone's got kind of strengths and areas of weakness over time, right?
Oh, absolutely. And and this is, like you said, this is something, I think at this point in time, most people are aware of a lot of development. They know what language develops like typically, and they know, what play develops like on some level. Like you have this intuition that, what play often looks like. But, people often label executive function, like you should be more motivated, you should be more this, you should be more that, when in the end, it's a skill set. And it has to, for some kids, it takes time to evolve. And like you said, it's just something we need to be aware of, because everyone has their strengths, and then some kids need a little more support and catching up.
Right. That's great. Well, thank you so much for taking time. We're doing this interview first thing on a Monday morning. My voice is a little croaky because you're the first person I've spoken to today, but I appreciate you starting your week with this conversation, and I'm just looking forward to sharing this with my audience. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I hope people found it useful.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. For the show notes for this episode, including a link to Dr. Bertin's website, his books, and all the other resources we discussed today, visit tiltparenting.com/session 163. If you get support and value out of this podcast in Tilt Parenting, I would love it if you would consider supporting it by joining my Patreon community. Patreon is a membership community that allows people to support content creators by making a small monthly contribution. It's super simple to get started, and I would love your help. To learn more or to sign up, just go to patreon.com/tiltparenting. Lastly, don't forget to leave a rating or a review or both for Tilt Parenting on Apple Podcasts if you haven't done so already. Ratings and reviews help keep this podcast visible in that ever-growing sea of podcasts. Thank you so much for considering. And that's all for this week. Thanks again for listening. And for more information on Tilt Parenting, visit www.tiltparenting.com.
If you're a parent, I invite you to join us at the Mindful Mama podcast, where it's all about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. With sometimes hilarious and always thought-provoking experts and friends, at Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm Hunter Clark Fields, and I can't wait to see you there. Listen in to the Mindful Mama podcast.